Nowadays, Memento Moris and Dead by Daylight are a set of offerings which come in 3 different rarities: uncommon, rare and iridescent, and that allow you to kill 1 or more survivors depending on the offering and its requirements. Now, don't get me wrong, I definitely don't think that the current Mori offerings are useless, since they can actually be quite helpful sometimes, especially in situations where a survivor has decisive strike or when there aren't any hooks around. Even though Moris have been in the game ever since its release back on the 14th of June 2016, they have actually been through quite a few different iterations, so much so that during the first couple months of DBD's existence, they were considered one of the most overpowered items in the entire game. But what was so different back then, and how did we get to where we are today? Well, in this video we're going to be going over the evolution of Memento Moris in Dead by Daylight, and without any further ado, let's get right into it. The ability for killers to be able to instantly kill survivors without having to hook them was actually something that the developers were playing around with ever since the game's early prototypes, even before DBD was in its alpha testing stages. But as we learned from the official DBD wiki, the developers ultimately decided that this, as a base mechanic, gave the killer too much of an advantage and reworked it into the current offerings instead. The phrase Memento Mori is actually a Latin saying, which can roughly be translated to remember death or remember mortality. And so it's actually quite fitting that these special offerings allow you to, essentially bypass the rules of the actual game. But as it turns out, the developers probably underestimated how strong these offerings really were. Let's take a look at the original description for the Ebony Memento Mori. Grants the ability to kill all survivors by your hand for the next trial. Secret. Now, how is this different from today's version of the offering? Well, if you haven't noticed, the description doesn't specify that you needed to hook any survivors. That's right, you could literally Mori a survivor after downing them one single time, and pretty much instantly get them out of the match. Now, when we're talking about stuff like this, we have to keep in mind that the DBD which people were playing in 2016 was more or less an entirely different game compared to today. First of all, this was actually considered a horror game, and survivors were absolutely shitting their pants when they saw the killer. Back then, for most Memento Mori animations, the developers chose to utilize the concept of less is more. For example, during the raids or the hillbillies Moris, at least from the survivor side, you would never really witness the actual murder, as it was just out of frame. Even though the next couple of killers released after that didn't follow this design principle, as we can see from the nurses or the shapes Moris, this is something which is still being used in the game to this day. Take for example the Nemesis kill animation. Now, although DBD was considered a horror game back in 2016, there was actually a lot more overpowered stuff on the survivor side compared to the killers. For example, survivors had insta-heals, original brand new parts, insta-blinds and so on, and killers didn't really have much, except for, you guessed it, Memento Moris. And so when the Halloween chapter rolled around, this update brought in 2 brand new items which utilized the Memento Mori mechanic, the Tombstone piece and Judas Tombstone add-ons for Michael Myers. Several updates later, the Hag was also added to the game, who brought the first ever perk which utilized the Mori mechanic, that being Hex Devour Hope. Now, even though survivors back in the day had a lot more overpowered stuff than killers, for some reason Moris were one of the first items to receive significant nerfs. And so, on the 4th of July 2017, with the updates to the brand new part add-on, Memento Moris would also receive their first official rework. Patch 1.5.3 was called the Victory Cube update and addressed the killer's way of ranking up, brand new parts, Moris, and other stuff of lesser impact on the game. The yellow Cypress Memento Moris were left completely untouched, while the green Ivory and iridescent Ebony ones received very significant changes. From now on, these 2 offerings would require survivors to have been hooked at least once in order to be able to be used. Now, as you might have already guessed, this was a pretty harsh nerf for Moris, as you were simply no longer able to instantly remove survivors from the game on their first down. Now, after this, Moris received a few miscellaneous changes, one of them being that if the conditions to kill a survivor using an equipped Memento Mori offering were met, the HUD would now display its icon alongside the kill prompt when hovering above the downed survivor. Chapter 8 Curtain Call also introduced the first killer in Dead by Daylight that had 2 unique Mori animations, one for male and one for female survivors, that killer being the Clown. The chapter after that also implemented the second perk in DBD to utilize the Mori mechanic, that being Rancor, one of the spirit's 3 teachable perks. Over the years, the actual kill animations were also significantly improved quality-wise. They went from being simple slashes to actual really well thought out poses and animations that had something to do with the killer's power, backstory or personality. Now back to the actual balanced aspects of Moris. Because more and more overpowered stuff on the survivor side was getting reworked or nerfed pretty significantly, for example insta-heals, brand new parts and so on, Memento Moris were actually left completely untouched for more than 3 entire years. Many players in the community, not just survivor mains but also even regular killer players, were absolutely certain that Moris needed yet another nerf. And so on the 8th of December 2020, the green and iridescent Memento Mori offerings were changed to how they are today. But if this was it, why are there still a couple of minutes left from the video? Oh well, something much bigger was coming. Something that I'm actually really glad did not make it to the live servers of DBD, the Finisher Mori update. During DBD's 6th anniversary livestream, the developers announced that in the next year they would be implementing changes related to slugging and the Memento Mori system. The developers also said that the Yellow Cypress Memento Mori would partially become base kit for killers, and from what was said, the community initially seemed pretty excited for these changes. But oh man, was the actual update a complete disaster, at least in my opinion. When the Finisher Mori public test build was released on the 28th of September 2022, one of the first changes was the so-called last standing mechanic. Whenever all survivors but one were either dying, hooked, dead, or escaped, the last survivor and the killer would receive a temporary FOV increase. Whenever the last survivor got downed, the trial would draw to a climactic end. Both the survivor and the killer would be moved to a present point on the map, free of any obstructions that could get in the way, and the killer's Mori animation would play out. Any other survivor still in the match would be treated as a regular sacrifice for the killer. Additionally, survivors could now completely recover from the dying state base kit. Oh, and also the actual Memento Mori offerings received a, in all honesty, pretty lazy and unimaginative rework to compensate for the Finisher Mori changes. Now let's go over the problems with this update. First of all, the base kit Unbreakable made it so that lower tier killers that sometimes had to rely on slugging to create more pressure would become even worse than they already were. This wasn't even limited to low tier killers, since other killer powers like for example Onis and Twins were literally built around snowballing through slugging. Not only that, but the Finisher Mori was also a direct buff to killers that could get multiple downs in a short amount of time, like for example Nurse and Blight, who, let's be honest, don't really need any more buffs. This update would also get rid of other stuff like for example giving the last survivor hatch, finding cool spots for Moris, and would have literally made so many perks borderline useless, so I'm actually really glad it didn't get introduced into the live game. As of then, the last and only change to Memento Moris was made in the 6.6.0 patch, when the HUD elements were removed during the Mori animation in order to allow for a more cinematic experience when killing survivors. Oh, and also, as of the time I'm making this video, we're still waiting for the upcoming Trapper skin to be released, since that's going to be the first ever outfit in Dead by Daylight to have its own unique Mori animation. Well, I guess that was it. We went through the entire evolution of Memento Moris in Dead by Daylight. Please let me know if I missed anything down in the comments, as I would really appreciate it. Anyways, thank you all for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!
I don't understand what's going on here.